Lexington, Massachusetts, February 7th, 2005.
Well, I want to talk to you about democracy and education, and John Dewey, one of the leading thinkers of the 20th century, and you've said of him that he was someone whose thought was a strong influence on you in your formative years. And I know your parents sent you to a Deweyite school in Philadelphia. What does that mean, a Deweyite school?
Not only that, but I taught children, and my father ran the Hebrew school system in Philadelphia, where I lived, and that was run on Deweyite lines, and I taught there, and we studied it, and so on. This is what's called progressive education. It meant trying to focus on individual creativity, joint activities, stimulating projects. There's a kind of a caricature of it, which has nothing much to do with it. It covered all the regular materials, but with an emphasis on the child's concerns, commitments, creative engagement. Very little, in fact, no competition. I didn't even know that I was a so-called good student until I left it and went to high school and discovered everybody gets ranked, so you find out where you were, but it's just never an issue before.
Did you ever ask your parents what motivated them to send you to this school?
Well, partly it was they worked. I mean, they worked in the afternoons, so I had to be at school all day. And this was, actually I started there at about 18 months and went through 8th grade. But the nature of the school just seemed, like I never questioned it. It was the obvious place to be. Wouldn't have wanted to be anywhere else.
Tell me a little bit about your father. What was your relationship with him? And of course, he was not only your first teacher, it sounds like your first employer also.
Well, he was a Hebrew scholar. We had a warm personal relationship, but it was a lot of it was, by the time I was old enough to read fairly serious material, we would spend every Friday night reading Hebrew, usually traditional Hebrew literature, modern Hebrew literature. Most of my daytime activities were kind of not in the home, just either school or streets or something. We took long summer vacations. They were teachers, so didn't work over the summer, and he was there working during the day. He came out in the late afternoon. We all went swimming together and that sort of thing. So it was a warm, happy relationship. Not huge amounts of time, but the time that it was significant and meaningful. By the time I was about, 11 or 12, I started getting interested in his scholarly work, and he was just about finishing up a PhD dissertation, either shortly before then or at that time, on medieval Hebrew grammarian, which I remember reading also his articles and talk about them, and
Do you think that helped kind of train your mind in some odd way in terms of mastering a complex language with a pretty dense grammar?
Things are pretty hard to say. It did get me interested in Semitic linguistics, and I pursued it in college, and probably had some indirect influence on my getting into the field, but can't really trace it.
In a book we did called Propaganda in the Public Mind, just to go back to your school days, you said that my intellectual achievement was retarded when I went to high school. I sort of sank into a black hole.
That's pretty accurate. Getting into high school was a bit of a shock. I hadn't been used to it. It was an academic high school, kids, the one school where everybody, the boys' school, of course, who were going to go on to college. Very rigorous, disciplined, disliked almost every aspect of it, I guess. But, aside from friends and so on. But it's true, I remember very little of it. And I remember elementary school and up through to high school very vividly. Couldn't wait to get out. I went to the local college. There was no thought of doing anything else except living at home and working and commuting to school. And I was very much looking forward to it. The catalog looked exciting and interesting, but I was disabused of that within a year or so, and found everything to be just a boring continuation of high school, and was pretty close to dropping out, in fact. Never really went back and had a formal either undergraduate or graduate education.
But at some point you wind up at the University of Pennsylvania and you meet Zelig. Oh, this was the University of Pennsylvania. And you meet Zelig Harris.
Yeah, I met him through political contacts, I guess when I was about 17, a sophomore, just toying with the idea of dropping out. And in fact, spending very little time in academic work. I think I was probably majoring in handball by that time. But we met through political contacts, mostly my interest, which happened in the binationalist anti-state wing of the Zionist movement, which I was very much involved in. And it turned out he was a leading figure in those areas, which I didn't know. And also he happened to be a very charismatic and intellectually quite exciting person whose other interests were things that I was also personally trying to explore on my own, anarchist thought, anti-Bolshevik left, and so on. So I was very much taken with that. I suspect in retrospect that he was trying to get me back into college, but he didn't say it, but suggested I take some of his graduate courses, and started taking them, got interested in it, went on with mostly other graduate courses in a scattering of fields. Penn was a pretty funny place in those. It's not like it is today. It was a really an overgrown high school. But there was a scattering of extremely good faculty in different fields, one in mathematics, one in philosophy, one somewhere else. And by picking and choosing, you could get a pretty exciting education without any much formal structure. And it was loose enough, so it didn't matter. So.
And did you ever actually get a piece of paper, a graduate degree?
I ended up getting all the degrees formally, but without having fulfilled usual requirements. The linguistics department was pretty unstructured. Harris essentially ran it, and it was, his students took his courses. And in a way, it was advantageous to me that the school was not a very academically prestigious place, so they didn't have heavy requirements and supervision and so on. You could kind of do what you wanted. At least I could.
So including your early years when you were helping your dad and teaching Hebrew, you've been a pedagogue, if I could use that term, for, let's say, more than 6 decades. What qualities do you look for you've had thousands of students. What do you look for in a student? What constitutes a good student?
Independence of mind, enthusiasm, dedication to the field, willingness to challenge and question and explore new directions. And there are plenty of people like that. In fact, school tends to discourage those characteristics, but I think plenty of people have them.
And did you ever experience, because it's not overstating that you're very well known, you have a big reputation and all of that, students coming with a certain amount of reverence and awe for you and reluctant maybe to challenge some of your assertions?
Well, I'm occasionally. I mean, it's sometimes true of students who've come through traditional educations in Asian countries, for example, where you just don't question and challenge. But at a place like MIT, that's relatively rare. I mean, it's a science-based university, so students are, in fact, encouraged to pursue research, to challenge, to question, and it's pretty informal relations. But much more so than it used to be. It used to be a much more disciplined place when I got there.
As your career developed startlingly and brilliantly in linguistics, you also were getting very involved politically. What did your mother and father think of that?
Well, first of all, I wasn't exactly getting involved because I'd been very much involved from childhood. As I mentioned, I kind of drifted into linguistics through that connection. They were, well, by the 1960s, they had to be worried because I was facing jail and, getting arrested and so on and so forth. When the issue of Israel and the Palestinians became central, especially after 1967, and then there was just a huge flood of vilification, hatred, slander, denunciation, and so on. They were pretty supportive of my views, but it was difficult for them. They lived in almost a Jewish ghetto. That was their lives, and they were pretty upset at the hysterical slanders and denunciations. In fact, my father even wrote responses in the Hebrew press to some of the charges and denunciations. It wasn't easy for them. In fact, I probably semi-consciously cut some corners as long as they were alive, just to spare them the effects.
Sometimes you're described as a narco-syndicalist, and I've even heard you describe yourself as a kind of old-fashioned conservative. How do you feel about those terms? Or do you want to be free from any kind of labeling?
Well, I don't use labeling much, but I do feel that I grew out of the anarcho-syndicalist tradition. Some of the earliest material that I read back actually even in the late 1930s and later. And I feel that that's a sensible approach to the general problems of human society. I mean, you can't take doctrines and mechanically apply them. But the belief in workers' control of industry, community, popular control of communities, interaction among economic units, productive, commercial, and others, self-managed, self-owned, and other integral communities like neighborhoods and so on. That's a sensible basis for a complex society like ours. In that sense, I think anarcho-syndicalist ideas are quite reasonable. Old-fashioned conservative, by that I mean partly it's personal tastes, music, literature, and so on, which is my own business. But partly in this domain, it's a belief that classical liberal doctrines made a lot of sense. Again, they're not applicable to the modern world and the mode in which they were formulated. But the Enlightenment ideals that we were talking about, I think one has to have a good deal of respect for and should try to amplify, modify, adapt them to a modern society.
There's been some comment since the November 2nd election and even before then that Enlightenment ideas are under attack, particularly in education where abstinence is being taught but not other forms of protective sex. Darwin's theories being ignored. Creationism is being taught in some schools. Textbooks are being censored. Is this something worrying? Have you been tracking this?
Well, this is a very worrisome feature of general American culture, which is off the international spectrum in this respect, I should say. So there's no other industrial country where there's anything like the extremist religious beliefs and irrational commitments that are pretty common in the United States. I mean, the idea that you have to avoid teaching evolution or pretend you're not teaching it, that's in the industrial world, that's unique to the United States. And the statistics are mind-boggling. I don't remember them exactly, but roughly half the population thinks the world was created a couple of thousand years ago. A huge percentage, maybe a third or a quarter or so, say they've had a born-again experience. There's, I don't know, again, the numbers, but there's a substantial commitment to what's called rapture. Large majorities are convinced of miracles, the existence of the devil, on and on. And these are strains that go pretty far back in American history and have not been, in recent years, have come to affect general social and even political life to an extent that was not true in the past. So, for example, up till actually Carter, I suppose, no American president had to pretend to be a religious fanatic, but since then everyone does. It's part of a development of, in my view, undermining democracy that's been going on since the 1970s. One method, Carter probably inadvertently, I don't think this was intention, but taught the lesson that you can mobilize a large constituency by presenting yourself, honestly or not, as a Bible-fearing, quasi-evangelical Christian, or other deep religious commitment. Up until that point, these were people's personal concerns, not a necessary, not converted by the public relations system into a necessary way of presenting oneself as a political figure. There has been a pretty conscious takeover of the electoral system by, essentially by the public relations industry, which is given the task of selling candidates pretty much the way they sell commodities, and that's projecting imagery, just like on advertisements, and the image of a God-fearing, believing person of deep faith who's going to, protect you from the crimes of the modern world and so on, has been one that you can sell.
But there's also this tendency in American culture toward libertarianism, toward more freedom, and now we're seeing this juxtaposed with this surge in Puritanism. Let me just tell you a couple of things, cultural things, since I work in radio. We cannot play Allen Ginsberg's Howl, arguably one of the great poems of the 20th century, because it has a forbidden word. We can't play a Bruce Cockburn song called Call It Democracy because he has a very unflattering thing to say about the IMF. Or Bob Dylan's song Hurricane, where he talks about the unfair imprisonment of a Hurricane Carter, a famous boxer.
It's undoubtedly happening. There are for one thing, there's a big assault on, not just on freedom of speech and so on in radio, but on universities, schools, etc. There's I think over 20 state legislatures are now considering legislation, which I suppose some of them will pass, to try to control what teachers and professors say in classrooms, to make sure they don't, what they call indoctrinate students. The sponsors of the legislation explain what they mean. What they mean is that, as one of them put it, 80% of the faculty are commies, leftists, brainwashing students and their radical ideologies and anti-Americanism and so on. I mean, this is part of a kind of an old nativist strain that has existed, which is now being converted into a weapon against whatever institutions are not completely bought and controlled. The universities are pretty right-wing, but they're not wholly owned subsidiaries of the corporate sector, and that's a danger that has to be overcome.
I want you to go back a little bit in your memory to 1945. This year marks the 60th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it was just announced that the United States is developing a new generation of nuclear weapons, better, sturdier, more reliable, etc. You were around 16 at the time of the attacks, and tell me about that and the effect it had on you.
The signatories of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the nuclear states, have an obligation under the treaty, which every single one of them has violated, to undertake good faith efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons. That's part of the bargain by which other countries agreed not to develop nuclear weapons. And the steps that have been taken recently, particularly by the Bush administration, and this is another one, are going beyond non-adherence to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which unfortunately is true of all the nuclear states, but to really dismantling it. And it's noteworthy that this is proceeding side by side with concern that other countries that are non-nuclear might be beginning to move towards nuclear weapons. Yeah, we certainly don't want that to happen. But for the nuclear states to violate the treaty is far more serious and dangerous. And in fact, it's brought the world pretty close to destruction a number of times and is very likely to do so again. These new steps are quite threatening. They're being put in a sort of a anodyne fashion. We're just going to improve the nature of the weapons and make them more secure and so on. But it's very likely a step towards resuming nuclear testing, to developing more destructive weapons and more flexible weapons which can be used to threaten and destroy. And we should remember that it is official U.S. policy. Actually, it was even under Clinton, more extremely so under Bush, to use nuclear weapons if necessary in a first strike, even against non-nuclear powers that observe the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Those are very dangerous developments. Going back to 1945, I was a junior counselor in a Hebrew-speaking summer camp at the time. I was, 16. Yeah.
In the Poconos?
Somewhere near Philadelphia, where we lived. Yeah. And we just heard the news. Nobody was reading newspapers there, but you heard the news about the atom bomb. And I remember very vividly being sort of doubly shattered by it, first of all by the news, and secondly by the fact that nobody cared, which just struck me as amazingly unbelievable. But I just took off and walked off into the woods and spent a couple hours sitting there by myself thinking about it.
Well, was it because perhaps no one could conceptualize what it meant? It was just another big bomb.
I don't think so. And it's not an unfamiliar phenomenon. Is it surprising that kids in a summer camp didn't pay much attention to the fact that there'd been an atomic bombing? In fact, let's go back a couple of months before that. In March 1945, there was an air raid in Tokyo, which was worse than the atom bombs. I mean, Tokyo was a wooden city. It was targeted because they knew that they could create a firestorm and kill everybody. And then nobody knows how many, maybe 100,000 people were killed in a firestorm, burned to death, destroyed. Remember any discussion of that? In fact, I remember the 40th anniversary of that passed with 50th anniversary, which 40th anniversary, I guess, passed with scarcely a mention. There was a big 50th anniversary. The 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor came along. 3 years later, 50th anniversary of this. Huge fuss about Pearl Harbor. Scarcely a word about this.
Well, one final question in this session. As you look back over your many years of teaching and activism, what have you been trying to do?
Well, the teaching and the activism have different goals. For one thing, the teaching is really research. So teaching and research are inseparable, the same activity. And in that, the goal is to try, my goal at least, is to try to understand something about the nature of the human mind, how it works. I'm particularly interested in language, but as a kind of a window into the nature of cognitive systems of thought, interpretation, planning, and see what we can discover about that. I have my own special interests. One of them is to try to, a topic that has been very hard to study until very recently, and that is to try to show to what extent biological systems, and I take systems of thought and planning and language and so on to be such, to what extent their characteristics can be determined by very general properties of physical law, mathematical principle, and so on. And by now there's beginning to be insights into how that might be the case. Pretty exciting work for me, at least in the last few years. In the other domains, it's just kind of elementary. There's an enormous amount of human suffering and misery, which can be alleviated and overcome. There's oppression that shouldn't exist. There's a need for a struggle for freedom all the time. There are very serious dangers. I mean, the species may be heading towards extinction. I can't see how anybody can fail to have an interest in trying to help people become more engaged in thinking about these problems and doing something about them. That's what I spend all my time on.
Lexington, Massachusetts, February 8th, 2005.
Well, what accounts for the surge in religious fundamentalism in the United States?
Well, for one thing, it's not entirely a surge. This has been a deeply religious, I hate to use the word, but what's called a religious country for a long time. Actually, part of the reason why I don't like the word is that you can make an argument that one of the most sacrilegious activities and organizations that exist is organized religion. I mean, it's based on very strange conceptions about the deity. If there were one, he wouldn't like it. But let's call it religious. But it's been a very religious country since its origins. I mean, take where we now are, New England. New England was settled by extremist religious fundamentalists who regarded themselves, from England, who regarded themselves as the children of Israel, waving the holy book, following the orders of the war god who they worshipped, and it is the war god, as they cleansed the land of the Amalekites, and on and on. You read the descriptions of some of the real hideous massacres, like the Pequot massacre, and they are just like chapters out of the most genocidal parts of the Bible, which in fact they were quoting. And as the country was settled, a lot of it, moving off to the west, was also under the drive of a kind of religious fundamentalism with sort of pseudo-biblical origins. The Spanish areas were conquered under a banner of destroying papism, the heresy of papism, and it just goes on to the present. I mean, if you look, in those days there weren't cross-cultural studies done by social scientists, but as soon as they got started, it was pretty quickly discovered that religious belief in the United States is just unrelated to other industrial societies. Typically, there's a correlation between extremist religious beliefs and industrialization. That is, the more modernization and industrialization increases, the less commitment there is to one or another form of religious. It's hard to find a value-free word, but a kind of religious extremism. And the United States is just off the chart. I mean, it's like an underdeveloped society in this respect, and pretty extreme. And this has been true for a long time. I mean, I don't know how far back I think it goes back as long as there have been studies. Why this is the case, you could argue, and partly it's its origins, and partly it may be that it's an unusual country. It's unusually homogeneous, for one thing. I mean, we all talk more or less the same language. The changes in the recent years, I think, I don't think it's so much a change in the level of religious commitment as the way in which it's been brought into the political system. So until Carter, presidents did not particularly posture as religious. Since then, everyone does. And I think maybe we've talked about this. I think that's part of the process of depoliticization and marginalization that's going on to try to counter as a reaction against the democratic thrust of the 1960s, which has led to a huge backlash of many things, and one of them is bringing religion into public life. And it is quite extreme. I mean, by now as you know, the teaching of evolution, which is just normal in every other country, is extremely difficult here, and it has been for a long time. I remember when my wife was in college back late 1940s, she was taking a sociology course, and I remember her telling me that the instructor said, well, the next section's going to be on evolution. And I said, you don't have to believe this, but you just ought to know what some people think. I mean, I doubt if that happens in any other industrial country. And this was not the Deep South. This was, the University of Pennsylvania. So exactly what the origins of it are, you can sort of debate, but it is an element of American exceptionalism, one of many. I mean, another one that may or may not be related to it is that this has always been a very frightened country. That also goes way back. There's also a strange sense of security here. It shows up in strategic analysis and thinking. The U.S. is by far the most powerful and secure country in the world, but it's the one that feels most insecure. So there's a constant sense that we're just about to be destroyed. And this goes way back. There's an interesting book by a historian, a well-known historian, John Lewis Gaddis, who did the first fairly serious analysis of the Bush national security strategy, which he approves of. He thinks it's a good idea, sympathetic account. And he traces it back to early American history, approvingly. He traces it back to John Quincy Adams, who's his ideal sort of grand strategist who laid out the major plans for, he doesn't put it this way, for conquest of the continent is what it amounted to. And he uses as his centerpiece and the model for Bush's strategy a famous state paper that Adams wrote in 1818, justifying Andrew Jackson's conquest of Florida in what's called the First Seminole War. And Gaddis's interpretation of this is that this was just to protect American security, because the Florida area was actually, he uses the phrase failed state. He said it's like what we would now call a failed state, a kind of a power vacuum, which threatened the United States. And he cites the right historical sources. He doesn't say what they report, but if you add what the actual scholarship, it's quite interesting. He certainly knows it. The main books that he cites, which are serious scholarly work, point out that Andrew Jackson's invasion of Florida had absolutely nothing to do with security. I mean, it was a matter of expansion to take over the Spanish settlements, and the only security was against what they called runaway slaves and lawless, runaway Negroes and lawless Indians. Well, the Indians were lawless because they were being driven out of their homes and murdered, and the slaves were running away because they didn't want to be slaves. But that was the threat. There was this mixture of runaway Negroes and lawless Indians, the Seminoles, so-called, in Florida, and they were threatening us. And in fact, there were even some cases where they carried out attacks on American settlements, but it turns out they were in retaliation.